This is an interview with Drew Bowden for the SEC Historical Society's Virtual Museum and Archive of the History of Financial Regulation. Today's July 18, 2022, and I'm Kenneth Durr. Drew, it's good to talk to you again.
Same. Nice to speak with you again too, Ken.
Been
Thanks for having
looking,
me today.
you're welcome. Been looking forward to the talk. And I always start these things by going back a little bit, and I don't want to go all the way back, but let's go to your education. Talk a little bit about your undergrad and how you got interested in law.
Sure. Undergrad, I was an English major at Loyola University in Maryland. Graduated college, and I was teaching high school English and coaching lacrosse. And it became apparent to me that if I wanted to move out of my parents' house and and, and make a living, I probably needed to figure out something else to do. So I actually had an older brother who was very interested in going to law school and studying for the LSATs, and so I thought I would sort of tag along for that experience. And if I did well on the LSATs, I might apply to some law schools and see if I could get in.
So you did, and you ended up at Penn, right?
I did, yeah. So I had the opportunity to go to Penn, and went up there. Did not know much about the law prior to going to law school. And coming out of law school, I think all I wanted to do was be a trial attorney. I thought that's sort of what all lawyers did, and it certainly was what I was interested in doing.
Any interest in securities law, or did you
Well,
study it? Or?
no. And funny thing, so I was principally motivated by my desire to go work for a law firm who would promise me an opportunity to go to court and handle arbitrations and trials and things. And I went back to a law firm in Baltimore that, completely unbeknownst to me, handled all of the legal work for Legg Mason, which was located across the street in Baltimore, and at the time in the late 80s was really a regional brokerage firm. So I went to work at my law firm in September 1987, and as God is my witness, at that time, I could not have told you the difference between a stock and a bond. I'd never had a business class, a finance class, an economics class, or anything else. But a month after I started, in October 1987, the stock market crashed, and I was, fresh meat at the law firm. A lot of people made claims against what were then called stockbrokers, against their stockbrokers, and they told me, "Hey, kid, this is what you're going to work on." And it really turned out for me to be kind of love at first sight in many different ways. I really loved the business. I loved learning about investing and finance, but I also really learned more about and came to appreciate and admire like Mason as a business entity itself. So when I speak to young people, I always tell them, keep your head on a swivel. You never know where opportunity is going to arise. And I started as a young lawyer in September 1987, uh,
And,
almost completely uninformed. And I've spent my entire career now in financial services in one way or another.
and you did work in litigation, though, right? Talk about the kinds of cases you were doing.
Yes. So I eventually made partner at my law firm and worked there for about 7 years, and handled litigations, arbitrations, and regulatory matters for financial services firms. Most of the work I did was for Legg Mason, um, who was a fantastic client. When Legg Mason hired us, they said, figure out what happened. If we made a mistake or messed it up, make the client whole. And if we didn't, fight like crazy. Um, so we took cases to trial, jury trials, appellate work, lots of arbitrations, handling sort of contested regulatory matters, which back then it probably would have been the NASD and the New York Stock Exchange. Um, so that's really what I spent probably the first 7 years of my career doing.
Okay, and eventually you made the jump over to Legg Mason.
Yeah, I'd been doing a lot of work for them. And as I said, came to really admire the company and the people who ran it. At that time, I think I moved over to Legg Mason in 1994, and it was still run by Chip Mason, and a group of executives who he had really built that business. It was really a first generation business. And I just thought they were really smart, very successful, treated everybody the same, and with dignity and respect, ran a good business, and they offered me the opportunity to come and join their business, which I did. I walked across the street.
So this was kind of a legendary period for Legg Mason. They were doing very well. They had some very good investing going on for a while there.
Oh yeah, you had it at Legg Mason. You had Ernie Keeney and Bill Miller running the Legg Mason Value Trust. Ernie Keeney had his famous Thanksgiving list, a list of about a dozen stocks he would publish every year that people in Baltimore would sort of follow very closely and invest in. And again, it wasn't a formal product, and honestly, look back on it, probably didn't really have a formal or compliant investment track record. It was just a list they put out every Thanksgiving.
Mhm.
But it was very popular and very successful.
So you start to get involved in compliance here, and I want to talk a little, sort of broaden out a bit, and talk about this whole idea of compliance as it's emerging, going into the 90s. It hadn't been around forever, and talk about the concept. What you were doing and what others were doing to sort of build up this field.
Yeah, in the 90s at that time, you uh, the broker dealer compliance was principally coming out of the NASD. I think this is even pre FINRA and the New York Stock Exchange. At that time, again, Legg Mason was principally just a broker dealer. Over time, Chip felt the future of the business was in asset management, and so he went out and began to acquire asset management firms, where Legg Mason would buy 100% of the equity in the company, but otherwise sort of leave them alone. That was part of Chip's deal proposition. And really, over that time in advisory world, the SEC, as it still is today, was the only regulatory entity sort of examining and overseeing investment advisors. And the emphasis, I think, early on was on policies and procedures. Sort of, do you have a policy manual? Do you have procedures? Um, During the time I was at Legg Mason, we were examined many times. We are just up the road from the SEC, and that was typically where exams started. Give me your policy manual.
Hmm. And did you have to write one of those, or could you pull one out of the cupboard?
Well, it's actually we did. I think the SEC actually adopted the what's called the compliance rule 20647 in 2004. Prior to that, at Legg Mason, Chip had acquired, I don't know the exact number, but I'll call it between a dozen and 15 asset management firms. And I was working at the parent company, and we were responsible at the parent company level for sort of overseeing the business of the subsidiaries that Legg Mason owned. And even before the SEC rule, we published our own little manual for our affiliate firms and said you have to identify an individual who's the compliance officer, and you have to have a policy manual, and you have to address the following, I forget it was probably a dozen or 15 different topics that we made him have. And so by the time the compliance rule came into effect at the behest of the SEC in 2004, we were already there.
So Gene Gelke would have been the one doing the investment advisor, the investment company uh, uh, examinations. Did you work with him?
Yeah, yeah. Gene was there for a long time. As I mentioned, we were right up the road in Baltimore, and growing. And Gene was a wonderful person, who I always admired, and who most seemed most interested to me in understanding things and sort of getting it right. So from time to time, when I was at Legg Mason, Gene would pick up the phone and call informally, and ask questions about a particular market development or practice or something that he was seeing in the industry that he or his team wanted to get more information about. Um, Sometimes those were phone calls. Sometimes he'd say, "Can we come up the road and spend a couple hours with your team? And it's not an exam. You're not in trouble. We just want you to walk us through it and help us understand it." So I would say we had a regular working relationship when I was at Legg Mason.
Okay. Well, let's get you to the SEC. Was that something you had your eye on? Had you thought about making the jump to become a regulator, or how did that happen?
Yeah, I would say only amorphously. In the time that I had worked up to that point in my time at Legg Mason, I always observed I never met anybody who worked at the SEC who didn't have a great experience, who didn't describe it as a rewarding part of their career. I was always attracted by sort of the opportunity to do public service. Um, but what practically happened was the global financial crisis. Um, so coming out of that in
Mm.
2011, there was a lot of change going on in the industry. The Legg Mason affiliate at which I was working had lost a lot of assets. We had gone through a couple rounds of layoffs, and it looked like it was about time to start exploring what other options might be available out there if the worst came to pass, and I needed to find something else to do.
So you inquired about the SEC.
Sure. Yeah, among other things, right? So I just did the proverbial network, talk to people you know, see what was out there. The SEC happened relatively quickly. I called a gentleman named David Titsworth, who
Mm.
was then the executive director of the Investment Advisor Association, both a professional acquaintance and a friend, and explained to him and said, "Hey, David, kind of thinking I might need something to do here. Any ideas?" And he mentioned to me, he said, "Well, just yesterday, I met with Carlo DeFlorio and Norm Champ." And Gene Gelke is leaving as the head of the investment advisor program at the SEC, and they're looking for somebody to succeed Gene. Do you think you'd want to talk to them? To which I said, "Yeah, sure. I'd love to talk to him." So I hung up the phone with David, and I don't think it was more than a half hour later, Carlo was calling me saying, "This is Carlo DeFlorio. Understand you might be interested. Can you come down to the SEC tomorrow and meet with Norm and me and talk about the position?" Which I did.
So what were did they want to talk about? Carlo was kind of reinventing the examinations program. What was he talking to you about?
Yeah, um, he was in the midst of a pretty significant change program in OC. I think they were looking for someone with some investment advisor background, which I had, somebody who it seemed like they would be able to work with. And I remember them asking me extensively about my disciplinary history. I think they want to make sure I didn't have any problems there.
Right.
Um, so those are the type of questions that we had. We did not, it was an introductory meeting, so we didn't really get into deep philosophical questions about the role of the SEC or the role of the exam program or those things at that time.
What was your impression of Carlo and what he was doing then and as it developed in your first few weeks and months at the SEC?
I joined the commission, and I very, very, very quickly came to realize that Carlo is very competent, had a plan, had done a tremendous amount of work. Really, I thought a highly effective job with the OC leadership in terms of change management and getting OC in particular kind of back on the front foot um, and on its feet. So it didn't take me long to realize that Carlos highly, highly capable, great integrity, very good communicator, nice person, and really was a pleasure to have the opportunity to work with and learn from Carlo.
Mhm. So you came during this period of transformation. Was it fall of 2011, something like that?
Yeah, I think yes, like November of 2011.
Yeah. Um, where was OC at that point, by your estimation? Were things still moving pretty quickly? Were you still kind of just looking for changes to make, or was the system the new system kind of in place and getting tuned up at that point?
Yeah, it was interesting. My observation, which is just mine, other people could have a different observation, but when I came in, it seemed to me that again, Carlo and the leadership of OC had sort of restructured and come up with a very good framework for OC, including specialized investment teams, sort of a new leadership structure, um, uh, and understanding on what the sort of the pillars of the program were, what they were trying to do, what they were trying to accomplish. And my observation was, boy, they have a really good framework here, but they keep talking about it. They keep talking about what they can change and what they can do. And my sort of take on it all was you need to stop talking about sort of what else you can change and what else you can do and just execute on the framework that you've put in place and sort of stop contemplating how you might fine tune a particular governance process or this or that or the other thing. So it seemed to me, as I look back on it, my perception was a lot of the reorganization really had been thoughtfully done. And what OC needed to do was sort of now get out and refocus on exams and putting the new framework to work.
Okay. And so your job would have been to do that for investment advisor exams.
Yeah, initially, yeah, I came in and succeeded Gene and was leading the investment advisor program.
So tell me about how that felt. You were on the other side of the desk at this point. What did you see that you did that Gene used to do? What did you start doing differently?
Well, the team was great, very dedicated, very knowledgeable, um, actually, and so it was a function of, I think, both trying to come up with plans for tasks that had been given to us that we didn't necessarily select for ourselves, but then also thinking about, okay, where is it that left to our own devices, we would choose to allocate the limited capital and resources that we had for the benefit of investors and the markets. Um, Probably the principal issue on assignments that had been given to us was coming out of Dodd-Frank and the
Mm,
requirement that hedge funds and private equity firms register with the SEC for the first time. And I remember pretty quickly coming into a situation where at the start of it, I'll forget the exact number, but in 2012, I guess, you had well more than 10,000 registered investment advisors managing somewhere around $40 trillion. I think a third of them had never been examined. A larger
mm,
percentage hadn't been examined for 10 years. And you had a couple hundred investment advisor examiners to oversee that business. So the business was growing rapidly, and the SEC had very limited resources to cover that cohort. And so then on top of that, Congress passed legislation that said about 2,000 new uh, registrants, hedge funds, private equity firms, needed to register with the commission, and thus began sort of a lively debate of what to do with those new registrants, from sort of put them at the back of the queue and do nothing, um, to I think where we eventually settled, which was devising a presence exam strategy that we began to execute on.
okay. What was behind this spectacular growth of the investment advisor industry, generally speaking?
Boy, it's tough to put it on any one thing. I think it coincided somewhat with, and this is off the top of my head, kind of the growth in the mutual fund business. I think back then there were a lot of progress made on portfolio theory, and how advisors could use different asset classes, with different risk and return profiles to build more diversified portfolios for clients with better returns. So that, generally the state of the business of advising consumers was moving from transactional buying and selling a security to more holistic and advisory and building a portfolio. And so as those capabilities came online, I think many of the firms, chose to allocate more of their money, just like Mason did, on emphasizing the growth of the advisory business, sometimes at the expense of the brokerage business.
Okay. Um, we were talking about the transformation that was going on in OC, and the kind of the spark that touched the whole thing off was Bernie Madoff. Um, what was the situation when you came in? Were there lingering effects of the Bernie Madoff trauma and on OC?
Yeah, very, very much so. And still, as I said, my observation sort of coming in 2011 was, uh, still a lot of conversations being had, and a lot of conversations being had about that, talking about it inside of OC and talking about it externally, which struck me as somewhat counterproductive. So one of my requests to my colleagues in the commission was, let's not talk about Bernie Madoff anymore. We have work to do, and it doesn't do us any good to bring that one up. So we had the proverbial you know jar where you had to stick a dollar bill in it every time you mentioned Bernie Madoff, because I felt like it had occurred. The SEC and OC had addressed it reasonably, and it was time to get back to business and sort of stop the self-flagellation on that one. It really played a big part too, Ken, in the discussions to make the point. The discussions we had about the presence exam strategy, which was we eventually settled, obviously first proposing that instead of having those new registrants come online and never hear from us, never get examined, which just seemed to me to be a really bad outcome
Mhm.
for investors in the markets, was we needed to figure out some way to get in front of them, thus presence. Part of our mantra was, if you're going to be effective and influence people, you have to have a presence and you have to be credible.
Okay.
So we proposed to the OC examiners in the regions a process where we would get out to see these new registrants, but not to do a complete exam, that we would pick a handful of what I would call sort of plain vanilla, right down the middle of the road topics, and ask examiners to go in and just look at one of them. Just show up and do a thorough exam on one subject, so that from a registrant's perspective, they had an encounter with the SEC. They saw it was rigorous. They would be motivated, right, to enhance their compliance programs, and that it was good. But because of Madoff, there was a lot of hesitancy on behalf of the examination teams, and I would say justified hesitancy, who said, wait a minute, if you send me in to look at a registrant, to look at one thing and then pull out and move on, what happens if I miss something? What happens if I go in a place and there's, something rotten in a back room that I don't detect? I will be vilified. I'll be vilified by the media, by Congress, by my peers at the commission. I don't want to be that person um, who missed it. And so we had a lot of conversations about how to get people comfortable with the notion that we could effectively go into a registrant and do something other than, a top to bottom multi-week or month exam, which
Mhm.
sort of is contrary to what we want to do, which is get in, be known, be credible, and get in front of as many people as you can and learn as much as you can over a short period of time.
That's interesting. It makes a lot of sense, given what had happened a few years earlier. Um, Another big event before we sort of roll into the things that you started accomplishing. Hurricane Sandy came along. Did you have some involvement in that?
Yeah, we did. I mean, not just me. I was working with many other people, many of whom have dedicated their entire professional
Right.
career with working with the commission. But I would say we were all at that point focused on what are things that we can do to sort of drive and emphasize we call them the four pillars of our mission. Um, and they were to promote compliance, prevent fraud, monitor risk, and importantly, in the case of Sandy, was inform policy. Um, and so when Hurricane Sandy came, you may remember, I think Lower Manhattan was closed for the better part of a couple days. There were many lessons learned, sometimes in the school of hard knocks, from Hurricane Sandy. And so, as a team at OC and a leadership team, we thought, well, wait a minute, we're the eyes and ears of the commission. There's probably a lot for the industry and registrants and the commission to learn about how people had prepared for a disaster, what had happened, what practices turned out to be really helpful and exhibited foresight, and what practices that you might have thought were reasonable, in theory, ended up being, in retrospect, something that people might want to go and rethink.
Mhm.
Um, so we sent teams up there to do a series of exams with firms, really for the purpose of learning. You're never going to walk away from a fraud, but what we were mostly interested in doing was collecting information from people about their experiences. Um, and we took that, and I remember distinctly we made a presentation to the entire commission, the whole panel of all 5 commissioners, to say, you know, here's what we saw, here's what we learned, which they appreciated, and we eventually, I think, turned it into a full-on risk alert to share sort of the highlights of what we observed with the entire industry.
Did this lead directly into Reg SCI?
Um, Again, SEC is a big place. There's a lot going on. I'm loath to ascribe credit for anything to any one person or even any one division at the SEC. There's a lot of moving parts. But I
But
would like to
we were
think that
talking about OCs helping to inform policy. So was there some sense that at that point you were helping to inform that policy?
yeah, I think so. And there were instances where we thought you could make better policy at the SEC to the extent you actually had facts and data on which to deal, as opposed to sort of academic theories. That's my own personal belief, anyway.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, and we would look for opportunities in OC where if we thought that a policy issue might come up or a policy issue ought to be considered, um, then we would do our work and gather our information and share it with our colleagues in the commission, really for the purpose of my favorite formulation of OC was always the eyes and ears of the commission. And so we did that work really for the purpose of having a discussion with our colleagues to say, in essence, like, this is what's happening over here. Like, this is what's occurring in this quarter of the market. Um, and you might want to take a look at it.
Okay. And about this time, this is about a year in or so, you were promoted to deputy, right?
Yes.
And I believe you kept hold of the investment advisor portfolio for a while.
I think, yeah, for a bit. Norm Champ, who had been the deputy, went to run the division of investment management. And so Carlo was deputy less there for a while. So it was a battlefield promotion where I kept my old responsibilities as well. That's usually the way it worked at Legg Mason too. You just get more things to do.
So one of the things you had to do, you were looking. I think there was some concern about 40 Act funds.
Yeah, and that was really had been sort of percolating from when I first got to OC, right? To your point about, stepping into Gene's shoes, taking over the program. I mentioned, there were certain things we had to deal with that were assigned to us. There were other things where I thought, okay, what do we want to go look at? And I was fresh out of the global financial crisis on the industry side. So when I got in and was working with the team in the investment advisor program, one of the first questions I asked was, can I get a list of the 40 Act mutual funds that have the highest concentrations of illiquid securities in their portfolios? And I was told, we don't have that information. Like, we don't know. And I remember discussing with Norm Champ, who then was the deputy director, and saying, wow, I would have expected the SEC to have that information, at least with some reasonable time lag, because it's certainly an area, if you're sort of doing risk-based exams, that struck me as one of the first places where you might want to start. So that's an area, Ken, I think, again, where from a request to a discussion, I think, again, I would not attribute it wholly to that. But you've seen over the years much more focus on the SEC on sort of how people are classifying illiquid securities, how they're valuing them, how they're reporting them to the SEC, and those sorts of things.
Okay. So this is all bundled up with the idea that OC is really targeting risk in a more systematic way during this period.
Yes, more systematic and more. Um, Again, I had been examined in the industry, and as I mentioned before, at the time, the exams at least started. I wouldn't say they were totally, but they started on policies and procedures. And coming from the industry, it I said to myself, if I'm going to do an exam and I want to know what's going on, I'm going to start with the trade blotter. Like, show me what you're buying and selling for your clients, and what you own, and how much you're paying for it, how much you're charging your clients for it. And that's probably a better place to start. So, in mutual fund land, I remember there was a period in Italy and Greece, and they were being devalued and there were defaults, and that's another one where we said, okay, well, let's go out and find out who owns those securities and how are they overseeing them and what information are they providing to the boards and what are they valuing those securities at. So I would say um, it was risk based, but arguably sort of a shift to away from policies and procedures, not exclusively, but towards what is actually happening. you know, which to me seemed to be a speedier way, right, to get to insight as to whether there was activity going on that was potentially harmful to investors or to the markets.
Right. That's very interesting. Looking at this historically, I know that the policies and procedures emphasis was part of an attempt to get the exchanges, the broker dealers, the investment advisors to regulate themselves, to have the systems in place where they could do the right thing. But what I'm hearing is that your sense was that the SEC needed to do a little bit of help itself, sort of taking a look into what they were doing.
Yeah, I think fairly. Um, I think we gave a lot of help and made a big difference in terms of what really was expected out of a compliance program. Um, and how do you bring tools that had been in use in the industry for a long time, usually on the investment side, right?
Mhm.
And I'm speaking now about sort of advanced data analytics, quantitative capabilities, um, and sort of my hypothesis is firms had been using those very effective skills on the money making side of the business to help you decide what to buy and sell and when and how to route it, and those sorts of things. And they had not really applied that skill set, that technology to monitoring their own business and understanding, I've been around long enough. You can have all the policies and procedures and you want in the world. That does not mean that that's what people are actually doing out in your branch offices or on your trading desk or anywhere else. So it
Right.
seemed to me, if you, like I said, if you're really interested in promoting compliance and doing a good job and overseeing your business, then you want to employ advanced data analytics and quantitative skills to your business in a compliance function so that you can really understand um, what's happening. Um, Again, and not through sampling 20 trades, but like look at what's been going on in a particular part of your business over a period of months or quarters or years.
Mhm.
And so I think the emphasis of the program when I was there on let's get into the trade blotter, let's get into the trade room, let's use advanced data analytics to understand what's going on in these businesses. Um, uh, I would like to think help to awaken the industry both to the importance and utility of those tools in the compliance realm. Um, but also part of our hypothesis was if you're a registrant, the absolute last thing in the world you want is the SEC to come in and look at your data and tell you things about your business that you don't know. That would be very uncomfortable. And so we were, if you go back and look at risk alerts and priorities and speeches and other things, we were pretty out there and pretty vocal about we're coming in to look at your data. And we're not sampling. We're going to ask for a bunch of data and we're going to go away and analyze it.
Where were these tools coming from? The new data analytics tools that the SEC was employing at this point.
I mean, again, it was a function of, I think OCIE had always had um, data analysis, so was working on being risk focused and risk measured. I think what happened was so allocating more resources to it and going and getting people who were real quants, people with PhDs in mathematics and computational science who had worked at NASA or in medical fields. And what we could offer them, if you're a data wonk and you like working with data and gaining insights out of data, the SEC is really an ideal place to work, because we might have been undermanned or understaffed from a personnel standpoint, but we had mountains of data and we could get any data we wanted. This is one of the coolest things about working at the SEC is you could pretty much ask for anything and people were obliged to give it to you. Um, so we built a quantitative analytics unit, and we had a very competitive hiring process, testing people, and we tried to build um, sort of a mighty and highly evolved team, um, who like weren't just really good at Excel and macros, but people who were data scientists,
Hmm.
who could sink their teeth uh, into that resource of the commissions.
Being able to pay good help, or not just help, but real significant expertise like that, was always usually a challenge for the commission before. Were you able to provide competitive pay to these people with PhDs at this point?
Yeah, yeah, we were. The pace, again, this is way before my time, and those before me sort of made those strides on behalf of the commission and OC in particular. But the pay scales and the amounts that we were paying, Carlo had really started an initiative to try to bring in people with specialized expertise, whether it was quantitative analytics or whether it was trading or whether it was derivatives. There was sort of a whole laundry list of skill sets that the examination program was looking for at the time. Um, but I would say we were not hampered from a compensation standpoint, and we could sell, especially on the quants. Most of the people, and really one of the pleasures about working with the commission, I mean, the mission is protect investors and promote the integrity and vibrancy of our capital markets. Like, most people can get behind that. That's pretty compelling, compelling mission to come to work every day. And as I mentioned before, for the quants, it was, we can give you an opportunity to do work and make advances and make strides, tremendous strides, because it's really a nascent initiative, um, or an initiative that's sort of starting to roll downhill and gain steam. Um, and yeah, we were able to recruit great people.
Okay. Well, maybe we should sort of go into your period as director at this point. Is there anything else we should talk about that you worked on as deputy or in the investment advisory area?
Um, we talked some about resources. That was always an interesting issue, really from the moment I walked in the door. Uh, Obviously, OC is sort of organized by registrant type. So there was an investment advisor program. There was a separate broker dealer oversight program. And as we've talked about, as the investment advisory industry continued to grow and grow and grow, and the SEC really could not keep up from a resource perspective, one of the big questions was, should you allocate resources from a different program? And usually it was the broker dealer program, um, to the investment advisory program, um, just to get more coverage and get more exams done and those sorts of things.
Okay.
And that was, on that one, I mean, to me, it started sort of an interesting discussion of, I felt it was always unfair that the investment advisor program, and really OC as a whole, tended to be evaluated exclusively by the number of exams it did, which certainly, like, that's the business, like, that's what you're supposed to do. So, like, I get it. But it didn't seem to me to be like the best or the fairest measuring stick of the effectiveness of the program, given the other things we were trying to do, right? Inform policy, promote compliance, um, uh, monitor risk, and those sorts of things. And so, I my belief and sort of what I preach is, look, what we're trying to do is influence people, right? That's all we're trying to do. We're trying to influence people to behave in ways that work better for investors and for the markets. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Exams are just one. And so we started again, if you look at some of the annual reports and other things we put out at that time, we did start to keep better track and promote or self promote, if you will, what we were doing in terms of our engagement with the industry, um, in terms of work we were doing with the policy divisions and those sorts of things. And we really, at least I did, started to think about the job as what's the most cost effective way to influence people and move the needle.
Mm.
Um, and to move away from saying, hey, measure how good OC's doing by the number of exams. But at any rate, in IAIC, we were way behind. People want to do the broker dealer. The fact of the matter is, at the time, I think, um, even with FINRA examining broker dealers, um, I believe the stats were between FINRA and the SEC, they had examined sort of less than 1% of sort of some small percentage of the branch offices of broker dealers.
Mm.
Um, and we continued to see, even with FINRA's oversight, the business was still significant enough that we continue to see issues. So it just, um, I know eventually I think Mark Wyatt did move resources from broker dealer to advisory, which again we had talked about and is a reasonable thing to do. I could never quite get myself um, comfortable with that because I felt like it was, I don't know how you'd put it, but you know, robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Well, one of the things I wanted to do was ask you what your priorities were, or what was driving, sort of your your policy initiative when you took over as director. And it's kind of sounding like you'd already answered that. You talked about influencing people.
Yeah, well, some. I mean, it seemed to me, that was the mission but for myself. Um, and again, working with the leadership, it was interesting to me and informed actually by my time at Lake Mason, um, where, Lake Mason was a parent company with a dozen, 15 subsidiary businesses. The SEC was a headquarters or a home office with a dozen regional firms. And in the time that I was at Lake Mason, it dawned on me that at Lake Mason, all the revenue of the business was generated by the subsidiaries who actually had clients they had to serve and do things. And it struck me at Lake Mason that to the extent that the parent company is asking them to do things or requesting them information or changing how things are done, it sometimes could be a distraction and a tax and a cost on actually doing the primary business, which is serving your clients and growing a successful business. So when I got to the SEC, it struck me that the notion of Washington as headquarters, and particularly at OC, where there were always requests emanating from Washington to the regional offices about particular information that people wanted for a memo or for a conversation with a commissioner or whatever else it was. And we tried to emphasize at the time to the team that, look, like we're in the business of doing exams. Exams are principally done in the regions. Every time you ask the regions for something, they're not doing exams. They're turning their back to their region and shoveling information to Washington, D.C. So another one of the initiatives, which is subtle, I guess, um, but was like, let's stop calling ourselves headquarters. Let's stop calling ourselves the home office. We're just DC. And let's stop, you know, pinging and banging on the regions with the frequency that we historically have to give us information that we want. And why don't we, in my rule to the people I work with in DC was you cannot pick up the phone or send an email or ask for information from a region until you've exhausted all attempts to get it for yourself. And if you have to ask them for it, then you have to devise a method where you can get it for yourself the next time. Um, and so for me, when I was there, it was uh, really trying to work with the team. As I said, it was just kind of executing on, I think, a framework that Carlo had put in place that people were committed to, which was let's get back to doing exams, engaging with people, and being in the field. So that was one. The quantitative analytics was another one. We've talked about that for sure.
Okay. Um, talk a little bit about the annual exam document and how that was evolving over this period.
Yeah, I think Carlo had actually started the sort of a publication early in the year to the industry about what OC wanted to focus on during the year. When I became the director, you look at that document, I think it was 14 and a half pages long. No offense to any of the scriveners at the SEC. Um, but if you sort of believe my hypothesis that what we were trying to do is influence people, it struck me that one of the things we ought to try to do is not sort of publish a laundry list of everything that we might look at in the coming year, but try to produce a document that was a little tighter and a little shorter, um, and that really emphasized the things that we thought were most important for the industry to know that we were going to come and look at. Um, my goal was ideally, I don't know if it was ever realized or not, but my goal was I'd like the priorities memo, both one to come out at the very beginning of the year. So you start a new year, you get your priorities
Mm.
memo. But two, it ought to be a document that the CEO of an investment advisory firm might actually pick up and read. And so we eventually, I think it had been 14, 15 pages long. I think at its low water mark, maybe. We got it to about 4.5 pages, which is pretty good, I thought, and trying to focus on that. So it was always kind of looking at everything and trying to think about, you know, what are ways to do this that are gonna that people will engage with, and again, that will have an impact, that will have influence.
Another way to have influence is speaking, and it looks like you stepped up the frequency with which you were the OC director was going out and talking in public. Um, and was that deliberate? Was that just something you happened to do?
Yeah, deliberate. I take no responsibility for it. That's a perfect example of one where I would say, you know, Carlo and the OC leadership sort of put the baton in our hands, and we just took it and went with it. Because I think Carlo had started what we called large firm engagement, where we would go meet with senior executives and boards of directors of some of the largest firms. In the regional offices, they were talking about kind of more outreach type of events. So I would put that, Ken, in the category more of just execution. Is we felt like we could more effectively do our jobs again if we were present and we were credible. So if you don't have enough resources to do in exams, instead of somebody never hearing or seeing from you, my saying was like, let's not be a specter in people's lives. Then by hosting an event or going to speak at events, you at least were there, right? You were
Right.
a voice in the room, um, and you were going to engage with people. So we had a number from the publications to the large firm engagement to again many of the regional offices just did a great job and put a lot of effort into getting out in their community, picking up the phone and calling people, hosting events. So yeah, there was probably a lot of activity in that area. It seemed to me, again, just based historically, maybe a little more emphasis than there have been in the past.
Okay, so there you were actually targeting resources to creating a public presence, to getting the message out somehow.
Yeah, again, I said it at the time in speeches and everything else. People can argue with me if they want, but having come from the industry, my experience was most people like they want to get it right, right? They understand the importance to their clients, the importance to their business, the importance to their reputation to get it right. Um, and so most people, if you can actually have a reasonable dialogue with them and give them some guidance, they'll self-correct on their own. That's not everybody, right? Obviously. And we allocated a lot of time and energy into finding the people who were not so motivated. um, but it seemed to me it was if most of the people were self-motivated and it didn't require a lot of resources and effort um, to give them what they needed to be even more effective, then that was a reasonable allocation of our time and effort and capital to do that.
Okay. Well, we've talked about speeches. One of the most notable of yours was the Sunshine speech. We talked a little bit about Dodd-Frank and private equity, so let's dig into that subject a bit. Dodd-Frank gave you hedge funds and private equity, and it sounds like private equity was maybe the bigger concern. Is that the case?
Yeah, I don't know. It's fair to say it was a bigger concern out of the box. Um, it was, I think I've characterized the year before, sort of an assignment. I remember people, I go to the Hill for budget things, and there's certain constituents of the world of like, why are you doing that? Why are you going to like actually spend time examining private equity funds and hedge funds? They're big boys. I would say, well, because Congress passed a law and they told us we had to do it. So kind of like, it's really wasn't any more tortured than that in my mind. So, I don't know that we had any particular concerns at the outset beyond like how the heck are we going to bring on board 2,000 new advisors and again have a presence and do our job and do the job that Congress had given to the SEC. That was really it at the beginning, and that's what we were trying to solve for. And it seemed to me, to the point, Ken, like the whole presence exam was premised upon an acknowledgement that although the SEC had done exams of private equity and hedge funds in the past, that was not really their wheelhouse, and that the presence exam strategy was purposely designed for the SEC to go in and learn and to collect information and find out more about these industries and their incentive structures and their business models.
And the presence exam was used in the private equity industry first. Is that right?
Yeah, and hedge funds. I think
Yeah.
we did both what we called private,
Okay.
private
Well,
fund advisors.
talk about the how the presence exam process worked. Did it work well? Um, who did the footwork, and what did they find?
I'll answer those though not in order. The team did all the footwork. So you've referred to as my sunshine speech. Sometimes my former colleagues call it that, and I always try to tell them it was not my speech. It was our speech. Like the exam program did it together. And so the present strategy, we said, I think very plainly, in preparation for this, I went back and read it. We sent a letter to all the new registrants and we said, we're going to engage with you. First of all, we're going to tell you who we are, what your responsibilities are, and we're going to tell you what we're going to come out and examine. And then we published a letter and said, here's like, I call them sort of plain vanilla, right down the middle of the road. Here's the handful of things we're going to come in and look at your firm, your marketing, your fees and expenses, custody may have been in there, I forget. But our thought was, if we want to be credible, like let's not get over our skis. Let's stick with things that we understand and can really put them to the test on, right? We know what we're doing. And then we told them we're going to collect, we're going to go out and try to do, I think we wanted to get to 25% of the new registrants over a period of a couple years. And the belief was if we do a couple hundred exams, even though each exam might only be looking at one or two issues at a particular advisor, after a couple of years, you'd add it up and you would have a significant amount of data and observations that you had collected. And then we said, and then we're going to report back. We'll come back to you and sort of tell you what we found. So that was really the plan. And that speech, again, really happened because that group invited me to come talk. Um, they it had been a couple of years, and they said, "Hey, you've been at it. You've been collecting information. Do you mind coming and telling us what you're seeing?" Um, and so I, turned around to the team and the regions and said, "Okay, you all have been doing the work. I'm the one they're going to shove behind a podium. But what do you want to tell them? What have you seen? Um, what is the report that we would give at this time?"
And that was the private equity trade association, more or less. I don't remember the name, but
Yeah, I don't actually remember the name of the group
yeah.
who had invited me to do it. Um, but again, it was sort of timely, and we had said we were going to do it, and so we used it as an excuse to to get everybody together and say, okay, what do we want to say?
So did you anticipate the response that you got?
No. Um, I mean, yes and no. I think even in the speech, um, I had to acknowledge like this is not flattering, you know. And part of uh, putting that presentation together, like I thought it was important when we were engaging with the industry, was to provide them with some context and some basis to sort of understand what we were telling them. Again, I didn't want to get into just giving them a litany of we've been doing exams and here's the 25 things that we've seen, you know, that are problematic in private equity. I didn't think that would have as big an impact as trying to say, look, you're relatively new registrants, but we have a long history of examining people in the industry. We've seen a lot of things over time, and here's how what we're seeing about your business, how it compares to sort of historically with other advisors and what we're seeing, and it's not flattering. Like there's work to do um, in the industry, and so in one sense surprise that got people's attention. No. Um, Maybe the degree and the nature of some of the reactions to it were a surprise to me and my colleagues in the commission at the time.
Why?
Um, well, uh, boy, there's a couple. One, and I think one of the things at the time that we were, um, I'll say, most proud about um, is I said from the private equity industry itself that they had some responses, most of which I think were constructive. But I said what they didn't say was that we didn't know what we were talking about.
Hmm.
Nobody said SEC has no business examining private equity fund advisors. You don't understand our business. You don't understand our model. Like you're all wet. Like basically leave us alone. And go back to looking at broker dealers. To my knowledge, I don't know that anybody sort of took that angle of attack with us, which is not uncommon at all for the SEC or OC in particular, for an industry or a trade group to say, you just don't get it. You don't understand. So that was I'll call that a pleasant surprise. Um, I think there's a little bit of surprise from the limited partnership um, sort of segment of the ecology, who I think we acknowledged at the beginning that a typical limited partner does not have the same ability and level of transparency that the SEC has when it goes into a private equity fund. So I always felt like our teams were able to go in and get information and ask questions that limited partners couldn't. But be that as it may, the limited partner, the reaction ranged from, on one hand, great stuff, really interesting, appreciate it, tell us more. How do we protect ourselves? What do we do? Um, to on the other end of the spectrum, there was a little bit of pushback on like, knock it off. You're embarrassing us a bit. Um, we're under scrutiny for why we hadn't um, um, sort of dug into these issues or asked these questions or done this work, which again was a little bit of a surprise because it seemed to me at the outset that a limited partner and the SEC are not identically, heck, they're not even arguably similarly situated when it comes to doing those types of inquiries.
Right. But they're supposed to be the educated investors, the more sophisticated investors.
Yeah, well,
Anything else we should talk about on the private equity, which did appear to consume a good bit of your time as director?
yeah, we did. Well, I mean, we created, as I mentioned, sort of under the Carlo and the team's reorganization of OC. we had devised, or they had devised, a plan for sort of specialized investment units, but people where you bring people in from the industry with special expertise who focus on a particular type of exam as opposed to being kind of a generalist or a utility player. And so, although I think it may have existed before then, I do think that the work we had done was really important in sort of allocating resources and formalizing the private funds unit at the SEC.
Okay.
And I think, to our earlier conversation about quants, um, I think that that gave the SEC, again, credibility in that area where you started to see highly competent people with extensive experience and backgrounds in that part of the market interested in coming to work at the SEC um, and working in that group. So uh, I think that that would be another one of the um, sort of outcomes, I guess, if you will, of that particular initiative.
Okay. You've mentioned the large firm outreach program a couple of times, but we haven't really talked much about it. Give me some of the basics of what that was about.
Yeah, that was, again, that was Carlo and Norm and the leadership team. Again, Carlo probably be more authoritative in terms of the rationale for the origin of it, but sort of same thing. I know when I got to the commission in 2011, um, when it came to some of the larger firms in the industry that the SEC regulates, like there wasn't a proverbial binder on the shelf that said, you know, hey, here's the Acme Investment Management book, that contains a history of the firm, who are the executives, what's going on in the commission with that firm in terms of, do they have requests for policy relief? Is anybody in enforcement looking at them? What's happening from a business perspective? And so, on one hand, Carlo allocated resources and set up a group to say, okay, there's a certain number of firms, of a significant enough size that we ought to have um, kind of a binder on that we can go to. So if something happens, we're not starting at square one, which is, again, great idea. Um, but part of that also was this idea of um, if its presence and credibility and influence was we should get out and meet with the heads of these businesses and the boards of directors and have direct conversations with them. We should spend a day with them. And in the time that Carlo and Norm were there, we talked a lot about how to do that most effectively. I think the bias of any government agency, including the SEC, was, well, round up a dozen people and and go see them. Uh, which didn't seem to us to sort of set up the meeting to have the type of discussion that we wanted to have, which is, tell us candidly what's going on in your business. Tell us what you're seeing in markets. Tell us where you see risk. Um, Give us a candid assessment of us. Like,
Mhm.
to tell us where you feel like we're not doing things that are working for investors or for the markets. And so in the last couple of years I was there, we would try to go out to these meetings. Usually it was two or three of us, Carlo, Norm, me, Norm when he was doing IM. We'd bring colleagues from trading and markets, but our goal was always, keep it to a couple people um, so that it wasn't sort of so overwhelming um, for the registrants, which is funny because the registrants often adopted the the exact same tactic to greet us when we walked through the door, which was lining up like 18 people on the other side of the table, um,
Is that
which is
what the
always interesting to
SEC had
me.
previously done?
Had they previously done?
Like go to meetings and have a phalanx of folks there to present?
Yeah, I don't know specifically in the context of large firm meetings. It was just sort of an observation um, from being there and observing. There always seemed to be a lot of people in the room
Yeah.
for somebody who came from a business background, where it was usually like, get the people in the room who absolutely have to be here, and we'll tell everybody else what went on. But there, it was interesting. I guess an observation I would have is at the commission in particular, and I'm sure a lot of other large businesses, information is currency, you know. So people tended to want to be in the room and in the meeting, um, because having that information was a form of sort of currency, within the organization, which I understand.
Okay. Any other things we should talk about from your time as director?
Um, I think, we've talked some about the data analytics. We didn't talk specifically, there were a couple kind of highlights of that.
Mhm.
Um, One was the development of what we called NEAT, or the National Exam Analytics Tool. So I mentioned we started the quantitative analytics unit. We hired really competent people. Um, and there were a couple things interesting about that, Ken. One was we told them, look, if I'm right, that insight will be gleaned from a trade blotter. We wanted to build a tool that would enable an examiner to go in and review years worth of trading data in connection with an exam. So previously, and this is not a knock on the examiners at all, but previously, the tools that they had been given were pretty much Excel, and it was kind of word of mouth, and somebody may have been able to do a macro or a pivot table. But again, having been examined, most of the time when the SEC came in, a standard request would be, show me 2 weeks worth of your trading blotter, and you'd give it to them. And the examiners really didn't have many tools at their disposal, as I said, other than putting it in Excel and kind of doing as much with it as they could, given their particular capabilities, which sometimes were sophisticated, but other kinds were kind of like squinting at it and trying to see if anything jumped out. Um, so the goal was to create a tool, um, that would allow the SEC to go in and not sample. Don't give me 2 weeks. Give me everything. Give me 2 years of every single trade that you've done. And I think by the end, it took a year or two, but by the end, it was running 50 different tests against that data for front running, for cherry picking, for marking the close, for allocating trades favorably to certain accounts as opposed to other accounts. And it became, I think, a for the commission, it became a useful tool, when doing exams. But to me, that was always the perfect example of how we were able to influence the industry to pick up its game. Because that was really, in my experience, one of the rare instances where the commission had a tool and a capability that the people we were examining didn't. They weren't doing that work. Compliance people were not looking at 2 years worth of trading data to see if they could discern any patterns of, potentially problematic behavior. Um, so that one I think was pretty cool. Um, and then you started to see, this emphasis on large scale data analytics, manifest itself in other initiatives. I think there was a risk alert. It was published after I left. Um, but the examiners went into 10 branch offices that were selling structured products, to their clients. And I want to say the team was able to collect information about every sale of a structured product to every person, um, over a period of years, looked at more than $1 billion worth of transactions. It was tens of thousands of different transactions that they looked at. But we're able to come out with observations, which to me go into credibility. Um, if you're the commission and coming in and saying, I've looked at every single trade in this area that you've done for a period of years, I've cross referenced it against the client information, I've followed downstream to see what happened with the investment after you bought it. And here's what we've observed, about your use of these products, and how you're overseeing them. Particularly, it was interesting where the results in some branches were far different than the results in other branches. But I always sort of looked at that, um, and shared with people that to me, that was a really good example of OC's sort of newfound ability um, to use those tools to gain insights and to really, I think, be credible and impactful um, in terms of making changes. It was so interesting, Ken, because we had, as we were doing that, there were so many instances. I remember one in anti-money laundering where the teams along the southern border, wanted to go into firms and look to see if they were filing their suspicious activity reports. And so the quants devised a list of all the data that they wanted to look at to help them do that analysis. And the firms, again, not unexpectedly, but the firms sort of said, like, what are you going to do with all this data? Like, you're not even going to be able to open the files. It's so much data. Um, like, this is pointless. Um, and we just sort of said, well, just give it to us. Like, like that's our problem, not your problem. Um, and the team was really able to go do the work, cross-reference the data, relate it to one another, and come back to those firms and say, here's some of the patterns that we've identified in your system that are going on in terms of money movements, which again, to my earlier point, we were telling those firms things that I don't think they knew about their business, um, which was very powerful, I think, and a credit to the team.
I'm glad you raised those points because you were the SEC and you were clearly making that message or getting that message across. Because in my research, I saw over and over this. We're looking at lots of data. We're using large quantities of data, as if you wanted to let people know that you were really taking a look at things rather than just sampling.
Well, I mean, again, cut away everything. To me, and this goes back to like coming back into the industry. It is, I believe, if not then certainly one of the most highly effective ways to understand what the hell is going on in a particular part of your business.
Right.
If you have that ability to say, go look over there, get a bunch of data, and come back and tell me what it is that you like, what is actually happening, not what they're telling me when I speak to them, not what my manual says, but like what happens in the real world out there. It is to me today the most effective tool for gaining those types of insights. And again, to me, importantly, gaining them with credibility.
Great. Well, let's talk about the circumstances leading up to your leaving the commission. And I know it gets to the fact that again you're in front of an audience, you're talking to people.
Oh, yeah, that actually didn't have anything to do with my leaving the commission. They happened to be contemporaneous in time. I think you're probably talking about the outreach event at Stanford.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Um, so yeah, so the SEC was hosting an event. Um, I believe it was for Silicon Valley, but sort of consistent with what we were talking about. This was part of the outreach. We were the host of the event. We were inviting the industry in to share information with them and other things. And we had a full day of presentations. I think I'd given formal remarks, and we went the whole day. Um, and it was the last sort of session of the day. The very last question of the day, a young man from private equity asked, gosh, don't you think with all this oversight you're doing, you're going to run people out of the private equity business? Um, which again, the answer to that is like, really, like, you kidding me? Like, get out of here. But we were the host of the event, and so in an attempt to be congenial, I guess, for lack of a better thing. I think I gave the right answer, but I did it in a very stupid way, which is I told them like, get out of here. Like you have it pretty good. Your industry's pretty good. I'm trying to help people. Where I was stupid, as I mentioned, I said, I have a teenage son. I talked to him and said, I think private equity is pretty interesting. Like I think it's an interesting business model, and look at it. To which he quickly retorted, like, I would love to hire your son. Ha ha! Everybody laughed, and they stopped the conference at that time. But that was really dumb of me, really stupid, because I think it enabled people to look and say like, aha, like both look at this guy from the SEC sort of cozying up to private equity and flattering them by saying it's an interesting business. And two, like he's shilling for his son. Like he's trying to get his son a job. Like that's horrible and horrific. Um, so, on both of them at that point, I don't know that anybody who'd fairly read the record would say that we had been currying favor with the private equity industry on the team when we were there. And two, so my son was a teenager in high school, so that's sort of preposterous. But be that as it may, it was stupid of me to do because it opened the door and it allowed people to, I think, criticize the work of OC and the work of the commission and a lot of other things, which was, you know, frankly mortifying. I apologize to my team, apologize to the chair. Yeah, that was just a really stupid thing to say. So I wish I could have that one back. That's for sure.
Yeah. But on the other side, you'd had the previous speech, which had been considered to have come down too hard on the private equity industry. So all of a sudden, it's flipped 180 degrees.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great job. It was very interesting. But in the couple years there is a lot to learn about navigating public perceptions and media in particular, because that was a particular issue on which it seemed no matter what you did, there were vocal uh, critics on the other side of it.
Mm.
From you're squeezing too hard, you're wasting your resources. Why the hell are you doing this? To on the other side, people saying you're not doing nearly enough. You're winking and you know and walking away from it, and you're in cahoots with the industry. So it was. Yeah, that was just part of the dynamic. Um,
Talk about the decision to go back into private side.
yeah, that was again, I'd been at the commission, I think probably for 4 years. I was not actively looking for a job. Um, I knew I wasn't going to spend the rest of my career at the commission. We can sort of talk about that if you want. Um, I knew I was going to spend the rest of my career there, but I wasn't actively looking. And I got a call from a friend who said, like, hey, he was a lawyer, and he said, I'm doing work for this company. It's a great company, great people. Their general counsel's retiring after 30 years. This is a fantastic job. He told me, like, I would take this job. He said, except it's in the middle of Michigan. Like, and I said, well, okay, you know, I'll talk to him. So that was sort of fortuitous. I think the way that happened, as many things are in one's professional career.
So that was Jackson.
Yep.
Okay. And what kind of work did you do? What was your title there?
So started there as just general counsel. The gentleman who'd been there before me had been there for 30 years, I think. It was to me, I say try to join a company that's doing well, which they were at the time. Get yourself an interesting role. And insurance, I didn't honestly have a huge amount of experience with insurance. I told them at the time I interviewed, like, you could fit what I know about insurance in a thimble. And they said, well, that's all right. You know other things. And we have a lot of people here who know insurance. Um, and I like the people. Um, and so started there as general counsel, additionally assumed some additional responsibilities for HR and government relations and some other things.
Okay. Well, I want to wrap up just by getting your perspective. You've remained in the industry more or less, and you've seen OC, continue the transformative process that you were part of for a while. What's your perspective? Have things gone in the direction that you'd expected? What have you seen happen at the SEC that you didn't expect and that you think is particularly interesting?
Well, that is a lot of open-ended questions, Ken.
Yeah.
Um,
So pick one.
uh, well, maybe I'll come out of our own playbook a little bit. I do think that the team and the initiatives that we did at the time um, around the analytics was successful. I do think you've seen the industry start to equip compliance managers and professionals, be they risk or compliance or whoever, some of the tools. I know there's vendors, right? I know that there's now compliance services which built their own trade analytic tool, sort of in the nature of what I just said. They go to people and say, hey, you don't want the SEC to find out stuff you don't know about your own business. We built a tool you can use to go find out. So I think that would sort of be one, happy consequence of it. I think that if you go back, we talked some, I can't say it or I'll have to put a dollar in the jar. We did sort of talk about Madoff. I would say, I think the team that really looked at the program, put um, steps in place to sort of evolve the program and react to that, did a great job, because my sense is, sort of back to my word, credibility. I do really think that the commission and OC in particular have remained credible, to the industry in terms of their capabilities, their focus. I think that the engagement has continued. I think they've done a really good job of continuing to sort of be transparent with the industry, share information. I think they could do more. Um, it was one of my observations even when I was there. I remember one particular instance where there was a market event, um, and it was problematic. And sort of my pitch at the time to the chair was, my team had been in right after it. We had a report for internal use at the commission that explained the whole thing and what had happened and what had gone wrong. Um, and my pitch was like, we should just publish that report. Everyone will read it. Like, it's current, it's timely. Boards will read it, CEOs will read it, and they're going to call people into their office and say, "How the heck do I make sure this doesn't ever happen in my business?" Um, but at that time, again, that was an isolated incident. But the idea for the SEC and the commission was, this is an enforcement matter. We need to pursue it through enforcement, and we need to conduct an enforcement investigation, and make sure we have our facts correct. Which again, I understand, but those things take time in terms of influence, right? So the enforcement case, came out 2.5 years later. It was long in the rearview mirror, and I still think that the SEC could do more, using its kind of privileged ability to get any information that it wants, pretty much in real time, and some of the analytical tools that it has. I think it could do more, um, simply um, in doing analysis and sharing information with the industry. That would be helpful. Um, People were great. It was, I have many, many friends, from the commission, lifetime friends, hardworking people, dedicated people. It really was. Anybody who's thinking about doing a stint there, it really was, a privilege and fascinating and exhilarating, um, to go kind of work for investors and work for our capital markets. It's a wonderful opportunity.
Is there anything else that we haven't talked about that we should?
Uh, I don't think so, Ken. I'm happy to answer any other questions you have today or in the future if it's helpful. But
Well, great. Well, I will be looking into this subject for quite some time to come.
I know, yeah, you have quite the run going.
So I will. I'll
You are
get
the
back to you.
foremost authority, I think, on SEC and certainly OC history for sure.
That's right. That's right. Well, it's been great. It's been a good talk. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, I hope it's helpful.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye.